Hi, y'all. Welcome to CoMotion Live Choose Paris webinar. My name is Kieran Jan, and I head up policy and legal at Replica. We're a big data platform for the built environment, and we've been assisting a lot of public agencies and private partners on how to think about EV charging and siting of stations, particularly coming out of the latest bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act that was recently signed into law. America is looking at ways to electrify everything. So we're very excited to be with our counterparts in Europe from Volta and the Choose Paris region, as well as Zeti, which is a EV fintech provider based in the US. As we all know, with this legislation, EV electric vehicle sales are in the US are at an all-time high. There's lessons that we can learn across from our friends in the Atlantic Ocean about ways to build out the necessary infrastructure to support this transition to electrification. France is second only to Germany in electric and hybrid car sales in Europe, and Paris has adopted an aggressive program of purchasing incentives and tax benefits to push rapid electrification. So very excited for this conversation with our panelists. We will look at broader policies in France and in the core Paris region for accelerating the rollout of charging stations, whether it's in municipal, business, or privately owned settings. So, the topic of today is really what can the US learn from France and possibly adapt some policies to fit the American context. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Romain Ernie from the Choose Paris region.
Hi, Kieran. Hi, all. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning or afternoon. And again, a big thank you to Morgan and the CoMotion team for organizing this discussion. So I'm Romain Ernie. I'm leading the expertise for mobility transportation for Choose Paris region. And Choose Paris region, just a few words, we are a non-profit organization and we support companies that want to set up or invest in the Paris region. So again, very happy to be with you this morning.
Thank you, Romain. And Vincent Grena.
Hey, Karen. Happy to be here. Hey, Romain also. I'm Vincent, so I'm heading Volta Europe. Since a few months now, Volta has decided to go Europe. Volta is an American startup that has almost a little bit more than 10 years experience in the US. And we are building a charging station, but with a different vision because we are mixing two things. Our stations are equipped with DOH screens, so we benefit from revenues from the DOH environment and DOH media revenue, and also from the EV charging infrastructure. So for this, we built mostly our station on private land right now, and also municipalities in France. And we have two offices in Europe. One is in Berlin and one is in Paris. And I'm, again, very happy to be here today.
Thank you, Vincent. And Kim, for the audience's benefit, can you explain what DOH is?
DOH is digital out of home. So it's advertising outside and on your way to work, everywhere. What you can see as a street furniture, for example, bus shelter and stuff like this.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry,
and now
thank
coming back across the Atlantic to Rebecca Saleda.
Sure. Thanks, Kieran. Good to be here, and thanks, CoMotion, again. So Becca Saletta, Director of Strategic Partnerships for a startup called Zeti. We're actually a London-based startup, but we opened up in the US this year. And so happy to kind of have a cool conversation around, what it's like building in the US versus Europe. Really what we're doing is we're a fintech. So we're looking at financing the EV revolution, if you will. How are we creating new ideas around how to finance the future of clean transportation? And so that's all basically the core of our model is looking at utilization, a pay per mile model, if you will. So paying as you go, paying as you use, something that can really translate across vehicles, infrastructure, anything, and a really kind of a new way at looking at thinking creatively in the financing space. So a little bit of my background, I actually worked for the British government before in the public sector doing commercial work for their government building out the EV strategy for the US West Coast. And so it's kind of fun to kind of jump into a startup now and learn about how really working with foreign governments across, the Atlantic, if you will, to help build out these new ideas and these new technologies.
That's great, Rebecca, and thanks for clarifying the London connection. I also just want a couple of housekeeping items as we get into the conversation. We do have a Q&A function, and so hopefully audience members, if you have questions for our panelists, please put them there. And in the chat function, if folks want to introduce themselves, this is a small enough group, please put in your name, title, and kind of where you're based, so we can also get a sense of just the geography of today's participants. So kind of with that starting point, and it's so exciting to kind of be with you all as you're at the forefront of really what is an exciting time, at least in America, as we think about, electrification of our transportation sector, specifically, around cars. But before we get there, I wanted to kind of tease out this term e-mobility, because I do think it is just beyond cars and what we mean by that phrase. And also, as you talk about that, could you also discuss the scale of the opportunity set in front of us, because I think that will also be of interest to the audience. And I'll start with Romain.
Thank you, Karen. Very good question to introduce the discussion. So for us in the Paris region, e-mobility is part of a larger strategy to tackle the climate change and really reduce CO2 emission and also air pollution. So we have three pillars to in these strategies. The first one is to really invest heavily in public transportation, mass transit, with buses and metro lines. So we'll maybe you've heard about a project in Paris called the Grand Paris Express, which is 200 kilometers of new automated metro lines, 30 billion euro invested. So that's one of the pillars. The second one is to develop really the active mode of mobility, walking, biking, and I will come back to that later on, but it's an important pillar for us. And the third one is clean mobility, and electric mobility is part of that. But as you mentioned, Karen, it's not only cars, but we're also thinking about buses, about trucks, and also about e-bikes, which is really important for us. So that's the main strategy if we can go in a global perspective. And so on the e-mobility, what we have achieved is really to have a low emission zone in the Paris region area, in the metropolitan area, to really ban all diesel and all combustion engine vehicles by 2030. So it's going to be gradually, but it's an important administrative tool but it also it's supposed to have some it's good to have the discussion on that, because it's a good advantage and some inconvenience, so we can discuss on that later on. But to get back to your question, yeah, electric mobility is definitely a huge topic for us, but it's part of a bigger strategy, and especially not electric cars, but trucks, buses, and bikes.
Thank you.
And
Romain.
also recharging station, which is very important on the infrastructure side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to get back to that challenges part that you brought up to later in the conversation. And Vincent or Rebecca, what does e-mobility mean to you all or your company?
I'll let Rebecca go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. Then over to you. So I think, it's a broad comment, and I'm glad you bring it up, because I think we're at a phase in this transition when we need to start getting a little bit more specific into that. There's one level of education on the importance of, cleaning up the transport system on all levels. But as we get deeper and deeper into this, we wake up and say, actually, we do need to unpack that and say, what does that mean? How do we stay kind of focused on lanes within that e-mobility space? So for us, being on the fintech side, we're not a fleet operator. We're not running our own vehicles. We're also not a financier ourselves. We don't have capital. We're kind of this technology in the middle trying to pull those two together. So that kind of leaves us at this bird's eye view for the industry, which allows us to look at e-mobility as both passenger vehicles, think of like ride shares, taxis, anything that needs to electrify any fleet there. Also delivery vans, anything in that space, kind of middle mile, if you will, and delivery. But then you get into trucking. And I think especially in the States, looking at kind of class 6 to 8 trucks is a totally different space of e-mobility that doesn't really get thought about all the time when you're talking to scooter companies. And so I think it really stretches a full range. And I think when we're talking about the scale of that, on one level, there's these technologies, on another, they're all different audiences that require different attention. And so in order to scale that, you need to get into each of those audiences specifically and make sure that that scale is actually matching what we say it is. And I think coming from the finance side, really, the limit of scale is the ability to finance that, the ability to actually deploy that technology, whether that's through government funding, private funding, or other aspects to do that. I think that's an important element. It's one thing to say how massive the scale is, it's another thing to match that and say, how do we start to actually deploy those technologies? And that's something interesting to think about, because I think we all get very excited about how big it is. And I would echo that across the board. And what's going on in Paris and what's going on in the States, it's very exciting. And I do think it's important to rejoice in that, while also acknowledging, what do we do, because it's so large. Oops, you're on mute.
I would say, and also, where do we start, right? Because the opportunity is so huge. Absolutely. Vincent.
Yes, same. I think one thing I liked about what Rebecca just said, it's the exciting world. It's a hell of a change in front of us, but we should see it as a very exciting moment for everything. It's exciting because it means change, and change is always something new. That it means also that you need to change your mindset. So it's this shift is easier to say than to do, and I mean. To take place in reality for every level of the society and societies we live in. It's going to take time, and it's also it needs to be seen as something positive for the planet, positive for everything that goes around the sustainability of transportation, of course. But all this is so for me. What you must understand from how I see mobility, it's the excitement that procures it and that generates and also those challenges need support from political side, need support from financial partners also, and need support from every player that can take part, and everyone at every level can take part also in the change. And this is also why it's exciting, because you are talking to many different stakeholders, and those stakeholders, they all take part in the value chain, and at the end you deliver something that is brand new and that will change the way we look at how we move around in the cities and everywhere else. So that's why, for me, e-mobility is a really global shift and an exciting moment that we are living right now.
I love that. And I'm actually going to just pick up on a comment you made around stakeholders in the value chain. And I'm hoping you can say more about what you mean by that.
I can say a lot about this, but if you look at the way things go right now, as Romain said earlier, for example, a city is deciding to ban, even if the word ban is not a positive word, but push back on diesel cars, for example. It means that a public action needs to be followed by private action. It means that the OEMs need to rethink the way they are selling cars and the way they are producing cars, but also the cities, but the private landowner needs to also to think of how this will impact their day-to-day business in order to provide what is necessary to make the switch. And so it means that if you look at a simple thing like EV or e-bikes or e-scooters, for example, in the city of Paris, it means that there's an infrastructure question, there's a regulatory issues also, questions, and also at the end OEMs and who provides what kind of services, and at the same time we are living in a space where everything is being questioned. For example, you see that the city of Paris again, or the region, the Paris region, is doing a lot of things on the share drives. You can find a car very easily. You don't have to possess anything anymore to move around in cities. And so this is also the mindset and the shift that is being that is take place in front of our eyes, and again, exciting.
Great. So it's infrastructure, it's regulatory, it's like who's providing the services, OEM, the culture shift, all of these things coming together to kind of meet the moment. Romain, I was hoping maybe you could piggyback off of what's actually happening in the Paris region, what Vincent is talking about, maybe share some best practices and solutions that you have encountered.
Yeah, I wanted to add also to the previous discussion. It's also about timeline, because sometimes public side say we want to ban this kind of cars, and the industry is not really ready. So, but we have some, as you mentioned, we have some issue to tackle on the climate change. So it's also a discussion between different stakeholders, as Vincent mentioned, but the timeline is different, so we need to align on that. But we need to push and to have a more aggressive target. So to answer your question, Karen, there are very interesting it's not experimentation, but happening in the Paris region. And especially I wanted to mention what we developed around e-bikes, because we have a strong adoption of bikes and e-bikes in the Paris region. And as Vincent mentioned, we don't possess we don't have so much cars in our possession. Owning a car make no sense when you live in Paris and you work in Paris. So more than 60% of the Parisians don't own a car. So that's because the city is quite small and we have a lot of options. But when we need to do more than between 5 to 10 kilometers to do the work, you can use an e-bike. And the local government they started a program called Véligo. It's a short-term leasing electric bike for citizens in Paris region for a low price, but it's only for a short period of time, like 6 to 9 months, and then you have to get back to the bike to the Paris region. It's really to test and to experiment at a large scale. Like nine months is huge, and then you can say, okay, I've done the winter, I've done the spring with my e-bike, so I know that it's relevant for me. So that's a strong support from the policymakers to push on the electric bike mobility. And also we have incentive. For instance, when you buy an electric bike, it's 500 euro given by the cities and the region. And when you buy an electric cargo bike, which is very famous actually in Paris, when I go to with my kids at school, usually people say, okay, what talking about cars, talking about the new car they bought, and now 5 years later they are talking about the cargo bike they bought, and but they really, so we see a shift. But to cargo bike, you can have 600 euros when you buy one in Paris. So that's something very interesting on the electric electric bike in Paris.
Yeah, it's much cheaper than I think we find here in the States, depending on the e-bike model. I will also put in a plug. The Oakland, where I'm based in California, we did introduce an e-bike lending library to try to get at some of these last mile issues, and it's a pilot that the city is experimenting with.
But definitely education, and we come back to that later on, I guess. But education is really key for biking, but it's also for trucks and for charging. But education is a key part for.
Education, if I may add something, education and creativity. That's something I wanted to say also earlier. When you are facing something new, you need creativity. And what is doing the Paris region, and there's a lot of other examples in Paris, but in every other city, big city you can visit, there's a lot of creativity around transportation. And that's also something that is very new, because this creativity challenged the way we thought of having a bike or possessing a car, and how we finance it also. So and on this I think Rebecca could also jump in, but this creativity makes a lot of sense and provides us with new ideas and new ways of looking at transportation. Yeah.
And that's a great segue into Rebecca. When you talk about creativity, let's talk about the work that you're doing at Zeti and some of the projects you've helped finance.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think just kind of naturally, like, the e-bike world is fascinating. And I think it's interesting being based in LA, though, a city that was completely transformed around the car, as we're all very aware, has its own transportation challenges. And so I think it's fun for cities to learn from each other in one degree. But I will also say, hitting a little bit on the education point again, before I get into it, is being a London-based company, the whole team is out there. And so it's me in the States kind of building it out, that education factor on saying, hey guys, we move around a bit differently out here. Our problems are a little different here. The whole kind of basis of our model is around utilization. So pay as you go, there's a huge bottleneck in the cost of clean transportation nowadays. These vehicles are not the most affordable. That's kind of what we know, we talk about total cost of ownership and they'll be worth it over time. That's amazing. Initially, there is a sticker cost at the beginning that everyone has to get over in order to trust that that investment will pay off over time. And so again, that's kind of where we fit into the picture. But I think when you're talking about how vehicles are used, subscription models and sort of pay as you go is a little bit more common in Europe. I think in the US, we're still very much, it's my vehicle, I'd like to have it. It's mine, like I'm comfortable there. That's where I stay. I want to know it's there for me. There's a whole kind of cultural bit there. And that's just talking about passenger vehicles, right? That's not getting into delivery, heavy duty, and bikes are maybe slightly different as kind of the gateway to helping us understand that sharing mentality. And I think that is just important to think about for a culture. And so when you get into creative financing, we are looking at vehicles as, basically the way our model works is we're working with institutional funds. So any sort of investors that would look to invest in things like solar or wind or ESG asset classes, if you will. So anything green that's going to have a good carbon footprint. And so what we're trying to do is basically reroute those funds and say, can we now invest in other clean kinds of projects? Transportation was never clean before. It is clean now. So now we have a whole ton of new capital that can be deployed into transportation as a clean asset. And so that's basically why ZETI was created. So for a bit of context, and when we're looking at that, there's these funds out there with new money to flow into this industry. How do we free up that money and actually start getting these vehicles out on the road as we're driving them, rather than getting stuck at that bottleneck and continue to try to hurdle over, that upfront cost and trying to buy these vehicles full out, or even within a traditional lease where you're going to be paying that every month, you're not sure how much you're going to be driving it. And you might have very guaranteed miles, but even at that point, you're going to need some flexibility as you learn how to charge it, as you learn when it needs maintenance, when it doesn't. There's so much education around these vehicles. And so that sort of educational bit around utilization, how are we using these vehicles? I think there's something we can potentially learn from, these small micro-mobilities of learning how scooters, you drive them per mile and like that makes sense on a scooter level. How can we start to translate that up into bigger and bigger, assets, and start to look at these vehicles as, ways to decrease emissions more quickly and just start driving them and have that sync up with the energy bills anyways. We could get into that, the sort of utility type approach, and maybe Volta, you guys might have some more ideas on just the way energy plays into a lot of this. And I don't want to get us too down that hole, but I do think it's fascinating to think about just the overall usage of all these technologies.
Yeah, let's talk about energy for a second. I don't know, Vincent, if Volta has kind of a perspective on that.
I can talk on one thing I wanted to say before talking about energy. It's I mentioned the mindset, the change of the mindset earlier, and this is exactly what you said, Rebecca, about the US and the way the US loves to have cars and to possess cars and so on. If you look at the mindset for energy, for example, and the way we will fill in our EVs tomorrow, this is where I mean, for us, selling energy and selling charging station, we need to have to teach or educate our clients, potential partners, side partners, but also EV drivers in the new way to look at how I will refill my car. And for example, before you were fueling in 5 minutes and going your way for I don't know how many miles you can run on a gasoline car. Now with an EV car, you can jump around and just plug it in when you are doing your grocery, plug it in when you are going to the movie theater and so on. And so it shifts again on how you use your car and the way you will rely on the infrastructure that is present where you are used to go. So this is something where at Volta we are pushing strongly, because we believe that there's no need to reproduce the fueling industry, no need for high power charging station everywhere. It does not make sense. Does not make sense from an energy availability also. Does not make sense from a grid connection and everything that goes behind. Because if you have only a HPC charging station everywhere, you need to produce 2 times the energy that you are already having difficulties to produce in Europe. So that's a hell of a challenge. But if you can just deploy the infrastructure that is where you are used to go, and that is also available and providing, I would say, sufficient power for the time you are staying at your grocery or whatever, you're fine with it. And then it changed the mindset. Don't go and don't drive your car around and go fill in your car at some point. You just fill it in each time you stop. I don't know if I'm clear on what I said, but I think I wanted to make this point on the mindset again. And on the energy, it depends where you want to go. You can go from a lot of direction right now. In Europe, we are stressed about energy prices as they go up. So it's a hell of a topic. And this is where, again, if I may talk about Volta, we provide something that is a little bit different and innovative. What we do is that because of the revenue we make on the media part, we can, I would say, support a little bit the price of the kilowatt hour that is paid by the user. And this means that our price we always try to make it more affordable for an EV driver to switch to an EV car. That's what we have in mind. So it makes easier the switch to an EV car because you think that you can rely on energy prices that will be cheaper. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Vincent. And your first comment made me think of the Jack Kerouac book, On the Road, that meandering cross-country trip across the US. Based on your comments, I wonder what that trip would look like if there was that kind of cultural mind shift. Maybe we wouldn't have.
I know that you can read in the French press, Les Echos, it's a financial newspaper. This summer, there was a journalist that did a 4,000 miles in the US with an EV, just to see if it's possible to do the Road 66 with an EV. And it was possible with a little bit of surprise. If you want to read it, you can find it online.
Yeah, that's right. I think it was in the Washington Post, but I don't know, maybe somebody from CoMotion can post that article. Thanks for referencing it. Romain, anything to add to that?
I wanted to comment on Vincent and the energy crisis we're facing in Europe, and it's also to comment on Rebecca, because we are strongly give incentive to people to want to get rid of all vehicle to purchase an electric vehicle, but still the price, as Rebecca mentioned, are very high, and with the energy crisis, the cost of charging will be also increasing. So we really don't want to just for the low income citizen in the Paris region, we really want to have them, but because the metropolitan area will be banned for all diesel vehicles, so those people they can't afford right now to buy an electric vehicle, even if with the almost 20 euro from the French government and from the region and from the cities. So that's a huge topic. We don't have the answer right now. Maybe sharing or more sharing option would be possible, or maybe a leasing, maybe some with this strong support. But what I can say is that it's a huge matter. It's a huge issue on our side. How people who can't afford electric vehicles, we can support them, because it's not enough right now, and we will ban all diesel vehicle or the combustion engine vehicle by 2025 in Paris. Is gonna be it's tomorrow, so we need to do more on that. So happy to any ideas on that. We are the French government is thinking of improving the incentive or the more option on that, but all the initiative that works outside the France would be more than welcome.
Yeah, and we're facing high gas prices here in the US as well. Rebecca, I don't know if you wanted to add on kind of how that impacts the work that you're doing on the financing side.
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate that we bring it up, because these are the elephants in the room as we learn as we go. It's like, okay, these things are going to happen. So how do we pivot? How do we remain resilient as an industry to adapt to these? And so one thing I did want to mention, and just briefly kind of on the infrastructure side, is we do also finance infrastructure on a per kilowatt hour basis. So all of this is freeing up that sort of initial hurdle. So as these things come and go, when you're doing kind of a financing model that's more flexible, when these things hit and you need to stop driving or pause for a minute because you're able to do that, you don't get charged during that, because if you're paying as you go, there's a whole different way of kind of deploying your vehicles. And, I'm thinking from a fleet's perspective, of course, this could wheedle down into subscription services that cater to consumers and, all of that. We would kind of sit above it. But I will say kind of one of the things we saw is we were actually founded in 2020. So when COVID hit, we were kind of getting our first fleets on the road in London. And a lot of them had to park up over the pandemic because it was a lockdown. And so we actually found our model was completely challenged during that, but it succeeded because what happened is they just didn't pay at all. They didn't drive their vehicles. They didn't pay for it. And then as soon as they started driving again, all they had to do was hit their mileage targets. They started driving a bit more and they got right back on track. And so that is something we haven't really seen before. And I think as the space is pretty unpredictable, it's on the financing side, it's on the financing industry to think more creatively about how can we loosen this and protect the risk. There's a ton of risk involved from a financier's perspective on all of this. We're on the front lines of a new industry. But that said, there's ways to manage that risk. And I kind of want to get into public-private partnerships maybe a little bit here too, and open that up because, that has to exist for this to happen. And I think a lot of the ways the public sector can come in is by helping mitigate the risk so that we are able to take these more bold steps and start to go that route. So before I kind of get down that road, just to kind of close off, that's where the utilization bit I can see with things like gas prices or energy prices. As these flux, fleet operators have the ability, it is still going to be something they need to consider, but to either get infrastructure on a per kilowatt hour basis and charge as they go, get fleets on a per mile basis and drive as they go, and start to loosen up their cash flow so that when things hit, they have more flexibility on how they're getting these vehicles out. And that's something we're trying to build, we're trying to look at. It's kind of encouraging at the same time, because I will say, as we're seeing the mobility industry flip over, automotive flipping, and then that's trickling into cities and public transportation, all of this, the finance industry is going through the same thing at the same time. And they're getting an awful lot of pressure to record on the impacts of their investments on, is this going into social good, governance good, environmental good? There's a lot of metrics getting pushed at them. And so it is encouraging that as these kind of scale at the same time, we're seeing both sides of it and saying, okay, how can we actually pull this together? So that's kind of how I would say kind of, what we're seeing as far as the freedom and the flexibility there. But, I could go into the public side too, I think, with my public background, but I want to pause in case anyone has comments or feedback.
Well, and one question I'll let Ramon and Vincent weigh in is, what we saw kind of with the grid in California recently, right? When Californians, you probably got the text message if you're in LA, please unplug, right? Like our grid is experiencing too much demand. Is there a way, and like companies like OhmConnect are monetizing those benefits for customers? Is that something that Zeddy's also looking at as well?
We're not looking at that directly, no. So I think the way we would look at, we're not an energy provider in that sense. So we would almost help break down from the back end, saying, okay, what cost per mile do you need to hit to make this work? What do you think your energy costs are going to be? And help them on the flip side to say, how can we actually scale you to a degree that that's manageable for you? But we would partner in that sense to almost educate lightly. We're not a full transportation as a service company, so we're not going in and doing the full research for them, but it's a matter of saying, what are you looking at? What do you got? How can we match that with you to get you where you need to go? I think in that sense, absolutely.
Yeah, more like managing demand response. I don't know, Volta, if that's something you're looking at. I realize the California market is very different, but there's other states that like face this as well, right? Texas did during, the hurricane season. It seems to me that there is a role for folks who are looking at the demand side of this, right, to kind of help with that as well. But we will have that for another topic. I don't know, Vincent, if you want to say anything before we move on to P3s.
No, you can move on. I just wanted to say that in France, it's something that comes up right now with the international situation we have in Europe, and where the utility provider will put constraint on the clients so that we lower down the impact on the grid. Yeah, same as in California.
Okay, so another consideration as we think about EV deployment. Okay, great. Well, we talked about public-private partnerships. That's something that's coming out of the infrastructure law in America. $5 billion over 5 years to, I think it's 500,000 chargers we're looking to deploy. We can't do that without the private sector's help. So would love to kind of hear on the P3 side what you're doing, Rebecca and Vincent, what's going on, and then Ramon, how you're partnering as well.
Yeah, I guess I could jump in with ideas. I'm conscious to lean into the public sector on the panel, but I will say, again, one of the reasons why I jumped into startups is being in the public sector. I was enamored by how, you have this unique perspective, this bird's eye view on an industry, and you've got all these startups trying to give you ideas and technologies. How can we move faster? How can we feed those technologies into the actual problems? And I think jumping to a startup on the flip side, desperately saying, okay, how do we clean up, how do we add clean technologies to the government? It's just a very interesting place to be. I found, Europe on the whole, and I think my experience with the UK was there's a unique sort of academia meets public sector meets private sector kind of crosshairs that we just don't have in the States as much. I think the silos are a little bit further apart, and I think we're just a large country, and so every 50 states are different. And so I think as a startup now trying to navigate that and say, how can we help in this corner? We've got to nail almost Southern California before we hit Northern California. Sometimes it's even that close. And so something that we're looking at in that space is actually, with all these kind of, like you mentioned, the funding coming out into the space, and that's amazing. I think from our perspective, our job as a startup is just to fix a problem or to work with other people that are trying to solve the same problem. So I think when you're talking about financing, if there's money going out there for these technologies, amen, let's bring it on. What we're trying to look at is say, how can we finance the gap? Because this money's not going to cover everyone. Is there a way that we can also collaborate with the money that the public sector is putting in and saying, let's gap fill, let's finance a little bit in between. How can you help us cover the risk? So when our financiers want to say, let's get these vehicles out there, they're not taking a massive risk on a totally new technology that they've never seen depreciate over time and all these kind of questions they have. When you partner with the public sector, you're able to pull in a little bit of extra, hey, we got this, And as a financier in the middle thinking creatively, you're able to start to pull those two pieces together, use the public sector incentives to deploy the private sector ideas. And that is something is brand new to us. But I think in the US in particular is a very interesting space to play, and something we're trying to look at. And a lot of that, again, is coming out of California. But again, as a startup, you're still navigating the public sector, which can take time. And I think we're all feeling this sort of time crunch. So I'd be curious to hear from the public sector side now, and just the advice you have for private companies to be working on these ideas and to bring you, what you need. I don't know if expertise on this panel, but I think that's something that's worth discussing.
Absolutely. Roma and then Vincent.
Yeah, maybe my advice, Rebecca, because I'm in between private companies and the public organization, and very often they don't speak the same language, and so I have to do the translation, and sometimes it's hard. But what I wanted to mention is a project we had in Paris called Autolib, and Autolib is a electric car sharing services. So we had 1,000 EV station in Paris. I think it was 4,000 electric cars. So it was like you have a monthly fee, and then you pay as you go and you pay as you drive. And so it was 10 to 15 years ago. So it was the first large scale, it's not demonstration, it was actually a commercial services in Paris. And we had, so the service stopped, I think 2 or 3 years ago, because the car sharing business, or the car sharing business, is quite difficult to be profitable. It's very difficult to be profitable, at least in Europe. I don't know in the US, but we see some players, some consolidation of players, but I think there's still some room for players. But the good news is that we have seen for 10 years electric vehicles on the street in Paris, and the service was very popular. I even drove my wife to the hospital for the maternity leave, so that was it was very easy, very fun to drive, and that's also educate a lot of people. And it was a P3, a partnership between the city and some private player. It was more on the public service delegation, so it was a contract, but it was built together with the operators, and it was a long discussion, but it was successful for the 10 or 15 years because it was quite popular. Unfortunately, the service didn't win too much money, so that's why they have to cut the service. But it was a good example, but the discussion start and was a long discussion before starting the project. So
it set the scene. What is good about this example is that at that time they created in one contract. Yeah, you had the infrastructure, the cars were provided, and the B2C relationship was transferred to a private entity. So at the end, you had, I think it was a private entity, maybe it was a public-private entity, I don't know, Romain, but at the end, they created visible infrastructure, visible cars in the streets, and with a low fare. So the low fare was the problem at the end because the private operator was not able to make enough cash. But they at least they created something that was that helped in the mindset, in the shift on the mindset, and so people are used now to have electric cars running around. And what we've seen so far is that, for example, the infrastructure that was created at that time by with the Autolib project has been transferred to a new operator that reinvests only in the infrastructure. But instead of 1,000 charging stations in Paris, now you have on the same land 2,000 charging stations with a high utilization rate. So again, the mindset, the cultural shift, and the fact that it was a public and private project, yeah, makes a lot of sense. And what we see, sorry, go ahead.
Go on, Romain, you were going to add.
No. I wanted you to add, and Rebecca already mentioned, but it's quite very important for us. We don't want to replace one old car by one electric car. It's not because we want to have the supply chain is not there. It's quite very expensive, and as Vincent mentioned, we need creativity and we need a new way for people to move. That's why we invested a lot on public transportation and also on active mobility. So that's and Autolib was key on that, saying that for people who they get rid of their car and they use the service because they I don't know, they took the kids to the football game, or they went to the theater, which was not very well connected with buses, for instance. So that was the key point on that. And but we even if the business is really hard, as Vincent mentioned, we are more than welcome we are happy to welcome new players on the car sharing, on the car new way of using cars.
Yeah, and I think to Rebecca's earlier question, kind of like, where's the role of the public sector? I mean, doing pilots like this is very informative, right? To understand what's working, what's not working. It sounds like one audience member said that the cars were very dirty. You know, is it the case if they were clean?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Some of them were dirty, and at the end, the service was like they knew that they will get off the service, so they didn't care so much about the car. So, but it was an issue actually. The thing is that what you mentioned about the public push is also on the parking, because parking is more and more expensive, and it's good. But when you have electric cars, or when you have the Autolib, you don't care about parking because it's already there, and it's also a strong act, a strong statement, tool from the public side. And I like also what Amsterdam done, because when you purchase you have a long list of waiting list for parking, because it's even harder in Amsterdam to park. And then when you have electric cars, you get in the front line because you have an electric vehicle, so you have a priority to have a parking lot on the street. So that's something very interesting for us.
Yeah, those incentives, right, and what gets people out of gas into electric. That's interesting. We only have a few more minutes before we'll open it up to audience Q&A, but I did want to again tease out Rebecca's question around the public and the role. Maybe Volta and Vincent, you can speak to your partnerships. You mentioned that you do both private land and public and municipalities. So maybe just speak to what it's like to partner, what lessons you're learning, and what some of the challenges are in engaging the public sector.
Well, there's no easy answer to this. The contacts we are having with municipalities, it's exactly everything that we've said so far. We need to teach them how important it is to deploy the infrastructure, but at the same time, they have financial difficulties. So you need to bring an idea that helps on the financial part. That's what Volta does. We are not focusing about the utilization rate of our charging station. We are focusing on how well located they are, so that we can transform the audience around into media revenues, so that we can finance the infrastructure. And that's something, for example, in France, totally new from a legal point of view. And so it's again, we have to come back to education, so that we can make municipalities aware of our existence and our way of doing business and financing the infrastructure, so that they can work with us. And so we have a clear answer for municipalities at Volta, I think, a smart answer, and we are happy now that we are working on a few talks with municipalities that I cannot disclose, but we are working strongly, and we are believing in the fact that those will be good examples of how smart you can finance infrastructure.
Yeah, let's tease out that finance part a little bit as well, because I think that's an important part when you're aligning incentives to get the public sector and the private sector working on the same goal. What are some of the kind of the models? You'd mentioned this advertising, and I think there was also an audience question about it as well, around what your advertising out of the home software enables you to do, and how do you share those revenues?
Difficult to go into the details of this in this kind of conversation, but it's quite very simple. We did not, if you look at it, for example, you can a bus shelter is financed with advertising. So the fact that you have advertiser pay to be visible on the on the bus shelter. Same with our charging station. So the revenue you make will help you finance the infrastructure. The most important question on the infrastructure, charging infrastructure, the cost. Someone has to pay for it. Either it's the user by paying the kilowatt hour price, or something else. At Volta, we think that it can be both. Like this, it's smart, and it does not impact highly on the user at the end.
Okay, and Rebecca, it sounds like you're really kind of between the user and the car. So did you have any interaction with the public sector at all, or do you want to share some of your kind of past kind of experiences in working with the private sector when you were in the public sector?
Yeah, I think I love the Volta's model. I think it's fascinating, and I appreciate the creativity behind this, because it does need to, oftentimes that is going to be where it comes from, as the private sector is going to come through with all these like amazing ideas. And how do we pull that into the structures that are in place, and antiquity and comfort, and maybe comfort's not the right word here. It's more just, this is how it works. It's worked this way before. It takes an awful lot to change things. I think it's also one thing I would say, to any private company out there, is just patience. It's understanding, like, manage expectations. This is an important relationship. And, you don't know the boundaries that the public sector is behind, that they actually really do need to follow certain rigid ways to get things working, because they're also going to be caring more about, uplifting all of society at once. Are we making sure that these technologies are actually being deployed to the communities that need them the most? And I think that's also something we have to acknowledge. And so as a startup, your job is, okay, I'm here to fix a problem. I think the public sector is an amazing way to kind of sense check that problem and say, does this problem apply across all realities? And I think that's an amazing relationship to build, and something we're working on. I think from the public sector side, I think the clarity of understanding what the problems are, so that as a startup, you are actually trying to solve the right problem, not what you think it was. I think that's an amazing kind of vision that we can kind of learn from the public sector and build that sort of bridge between the two, saying, are we solving the problem that you wanted to solve? If we're not, guide us to that. What are you saying? So we can come in and say, we've got this cool financing idea. Does this work with the structures you already have in place? How can we partner with the grants that you're pushing out? That's one thing, but on the flip side, it's saying, what do you want to see in innovative financing? It's like, if this doesn't work, do you have a better idea? How do you see, like, we can build off of this to fit into the structures you already have in place? And I think these are the kind of conversations that I'm excited to see happen more across the industry, especially because we really do need each other in that. And I think these pilots that we've mentioned, and kind of building out those relationships more broadly, is a big part of that. And so again, we've been in the States for about 9 months, 10 months now. So I would say the public sector hasn't been our first mover yet necessarily, but I think those are all relationships that we're excited to continue building. You know, as a startup, we're trying to kind of get the first deployments out in the States. And so a lot of those are going to maybe more naturally come from private sector partnerships. But I think ultimately, you know, what's going to make the biggest impact and what's going to actually make sure that we are solving that problem is pulling in and kind of getting the insight from the public sector to ensure that. So those are kind of some of the things I think about. I'm not sure if that's entirely different in the US than in kind of France, maybe, or Paris particularly, but I think there are elements of universality across that we can learn from.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, just coming like from the Replica perspective, because we are working closely with a lot of public agencies on where they should be citing this EV infrastructure. Most importantly, on kind of how it complies, right, with some of the guidance that's coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Justice 40, you mentioned equity, you know, is a big piece of it. Like, how do we ensure that 40% of these monies are benefiting the most disadvantaged communities? So kind of from a data perspective, we're helping kind of map out, you know, what are these trips to the office, or, you know, to drop off at school, what can be electrified, and those type of questions that public agencies are now asking because the money is there. So I think, to go back to Vincent's earlier point, right, you've got the regulatory, you've got the infrastructure, and then you have the OEM and service providers coming in, kind of all helping with this cultural mindset towards where we want to go from a policy perspective. So that is a great, I actually, on that note, would love to open it up to the audience. We have just 10 minutes left. And I know there was one question from Ann Schneider, who is based in Central Illinois. And so I'm going to just throw this out. And then for other audience members, if there's other questions that you do have for our esteemed panelists, please put them in the Q&A section. So Ann's question is this. Some locations in the US are working in partnership with the private sector to develop wireless electric road systems that would allow EVs to recharge while in motion or stationary on the road surface. That seems to be the next step in this evolution. How does that impact what is happening in Paris? And then to Rebecca's, you know, how is that impacting financing solutions? So I'll start with you, Romain.
So yes, it's an interesting solution, induction charging while on the road. We have experimentation, especially in the southwest of the Paris region, because we have an automotive cluster, and we have a lane with the charging, and you can charge your own. But it's more for experimentation for the moment. I see the technology maybe is not ready yet, even for stationary induction charging. We have some player interested, both French and international, but it's still too expensive, because you have to equip the infrastructures and also add the new supplementary equipment to the car. So it's also increase the cost of the vehicles. But it's a solution that we and the industry is looking. But I'm not sure about the roadmap and when we will have that in Paris, because it costs. It's quite expensive to put it on the road.
So cost.
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I just love these kind of ideas. Like, great, put it out there. What do we got? You know, and I think that's an amazing kind of, if we can figure that out, that can be such a game changer. I think, you know, from the financing side, we're always going to take a more risk averse approach and try to bridge those two. So you have an amazing idea. What you're going to get from a financier is, you know, what is that worth over time? Do we know how long that's going to last? You know, all these kind of questions, which are great questions. But again, where we're sitting, we're dealing with funders that have invested in massive assets like solar and wind, that there's more understanding around the kind of renewable industry. And so when we get into kind of the nitty gritty new technologies, that's, again, I think maybe where we need to pull on the public sector pilots that have been deployed to prove kind of elements of success. And I think as we kind of build that, then we can start to lump in the new kind of massive capital to start deploy those at scale, because ultimately, if that becomes an infrastructure that sticks, you know, that is going to be massively expensive to finance. You're going to need to look at how that energy is deployed across the road. You know, like, I'm just getting into it for fun here, but I think, you know, we're at the stage where after it's been trialed and you can get that, that's when we can start to pull in actually new capital to get that deployed at scale. But I think this is where the public sector, private sector partnerships are going to be critical. Is as we look at that, we have to think creatively. And I think, you know, again, we're going to kind of take a further stance on that, but they're cool ideas.
Yeah, and we've only talked about the build side of the infrastructure, right? There is also the ongoing O&M, which the public sector knows all too well, that you can build something shiny and cool, but then who's kind of stuck with making sure it gets maintained in a proper way. Vincent, anything from Volta's perspective?
So just to come back on what as Justin just said on the induction charge, this shows also excitement because ideas and exactly what Rebecca said, there's place for every idea, and how we will finance it, we'll see that later on. But at least there's improvement from every player and a lot of new players coming in with new ideas. So I think it's very nice. On what you just said on maintenance, this is the main aspect of the for my business at least. When you provide charging station, you need to provide them, and you need to guarantee that the for anyone that wants to charge at your charging station, they will be available when they kick in, and so it has a cost. And this is why, again, finding new ways to create a sustainable business right now, where we know that the utilization rate and EVs are not there yet compared to where we will be in 15 or 10 years from now, it's very important. And this is where, again, from my standpoint, sorry for this, we have found a smart solution with advertising, because like this, we make sure that our stations are working properly and have a high availability rate. But again, it means that you need to also on the value chain and work with the right partners everywhere where you want to deploy your station. And that's also something where there's a lot of new position, new kind of jobs, new kind of expertise that is created right now. And again, exciting.
Great, thank you. So one comment that I'm going to turn into a question that came from Michael Sagala, who I think also had experience with Autolieb. From my personal experience, living in a small city 15 kilometers outside of Paris, unless there are protected bike lanes on all the roads connecting the small cities, I will continue to use my car. It's just too dangerous to do otherwise. And I think that that's an ongoing concern. In the US also, we've seen fatalities just rise astronomically, especially since the pandemic. I'd love for you all to kind of speak to the safety issues that are also, kind of part of this analysis.
If I can answer to Michael, I 100% agree. The bike lanes in the density or in the cities like Paris, it's on construction. If you can experience the biking in Paris, it's fantastic. More and more bike lane, etc. But when you go outside the city, and it's difficult sometimes. The bike lane just stop at the municipality signs. You change the cities, and you don't have any more bike lanes. So I just wanted to say to Michael that there is a regional plan to on the what we call RER Vélo, which is not very nice, but it's a new bike lane to link cities in the Paris region, and it will start. It already started. And also I wanted to emphasize the 250 million plan from the French government to develop bike and to support municipalities to buy. But it's definitely, as you mentioned, Karen, a huge topic on the infrastructure, especially on suburban and rural areas, because I come from a rural area in France, and the car is the only option you have. So yeah.
Thank you for acknowledging that, Roman, because I think the rural question, especially in the United States, is also something we're grappling with as well, to ensure that there is, again, equity across geographies as well, and not just a focus on the urban areas. Okay, we're going to end with Sarah, who this is a great real life example, and she needs some advice quickly. She's at a Toyota dealership in the heart of New York City, getting her Prius serviced, and she's overhearing a dealer encouraging the customers to buy an electric car. But the customer says, I live in an apartment building with very limited street parking and no garages near my work. Where could I possibly get my car charged? This is a question that's coming up a lot. What's your answer? And then we will wrap.
I can take this one. So my personal example, I've got an electric car since more than a year. no plug at home, no plug in my street, no charging infrastructure near my house, but I've never had any trouble with it. So it means that, again, the stress about charging your car is a real stress when you haven't made the move, but you have to test it, you have to try it. You will see that on your way near where you do your groceries, or maybe where you go to, as I said, to the restaurants or movie theater, you will find charging spot, and you will charge your car, and you will be fine, because the range, you know, the what we call the range anxiety is a true thing. But again, the range of the cars are going up a lot. So yeah, no worry about it. It's just try it out, and you will see driving an electric car, as Romain said, is fun, and it's nice, and you do something good for your kids, I would say.
Thank you. Rebecca, Romain, closing remarks.
Gosh, I mean, I just echo that. I think, you know, all in all, I think the last thing I would say, and maybe ties into the last two questions, is, you know, it's not always the right thing for everyone at the right time. We're all moving that the way, but I will say, if you have the ability, you know, you also have the responsibility, and it kind of eases the burden as we go. So for those that are going to have a harder and harder time adopting these, if you're able to do it, we're kind of the first movers that are getting out there and making sure that down the line, those trickles down. And I think that's something I'm excited about, but it also kind of encourage across the board.
On my side, just to conclude, we are living in a challenging time, but it's very exciting, and it's especially in Europe and in the Paris region, we have a lot of projects regarding mobility and transportation. So, and we welcome every companies or every innovative idea. Like we met with Volta like 2 or 3 years ago in California. The model was very interesting for us, so we work with them, and so we are more than happy to work with the Californian or the US to make the bridge between the US and Europe, which is very important for us. So I will be at CoMotion LA, so happy to meet you there if you are.
Great. Thank you, Romain. And thank you, Vincent and Rebecca, for this wonderful panel. Great remarks and engaging comments from our audience as well. Thank you all for joining CoMotion Live. We will see you in LA.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thank you. Thanks, Karen.